and Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. Next, Representative Bernie Sanders talks about his life in politics and his experiences in Congress as the lone independent member. His autobiography is called Outsider in the House. Congressman Sanders is currently in his 4th term and is Vermont's only representative in the House. He spoke at the Northshire Bookstore in Manchester Center, Vermont.
Good evening. As you have no doubt noticed already, C-SPAN is with us tonight, so please be careful as you're walking around of equipment and cables. And the camera crew has asked that when it comes time to ask questions, that you go to the mic there so that the viewing audience has an opportunity to hear your question as well. Vermonters of all stripes have taken a certain pride over the past 6.5 years from Washington news articles that read like this, quote, "The measure was supported by a coalition of legislators, a total of 148 Democrats and 60 Republicans, and Representative Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, backed the amendment. The Democrats get lumped, the Republicans get lumped, and Congressman Sanders, Bernie, stands out in the Washington crowd in more ways than one. May I call you Bernie? It seems more appropriate than Congressman Sanders in this intimate state. Bernie Sanders is the only independent in the United States House of Representatives. No other independent has been elected to Congress in over 40 years, and none has been ever served 4 terms, which Bernie is currently doing. Vermonters elected him to his 4th term by a wide margin of 23 percentage points. Bernie Sanders is a democratic socialist, which makes my wife and me and the entire Northshire crew, who are all interested in fostering wide and diverse exchanges of views, very grateful for him to agreeing to come to our valley, which is known as a Republican stronghold. On NPR's Morning Edition this spring, Bernie was asked to explain the difference between a socialist and a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, and the ensuing discussion was intriguing. At times it resembled a civics lesson. Our congressman does an exceptional job of working his way into the woof and warp of the Washington policymaking fabric despite his independent status. He chairs the 58-member House Progressive Caucus, a group that helped spearhead the successful opposition to Newt Gingrich. He also made legislative history when he became the ranking minority member of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth and Natural Resources of the Government Reform Committee. And in Bernie's political autobiography, whose publication we are celebrating tonight, you'll read how his Brooklyn childhood shaped his political beliefs, and you'll follow his improbable 25-year trek from fringe party candidate to mayor of Burlington and on to his present congressional prominence. The book will give you behind-the-scenes views of his re-election campaign and the battle with Susan Sweetser, as well as sometimes humorous, sometimes moving passages about what the state has meant to him over the years, and to accounts of his legislative battles with Gingrich. But most of all, you get a clear understanding of his message and his analysis of the class struggle in the United States today. Bernie wrote this fine book with his longtime friend, Huck Gutman, who is sitting here, a University of Vermont English professor. He has authored 3 other books and taught as a Fulbright senior lecturer in the New University of Lisbon in Portugal, and has lectured widely on both politics and literature in India, Tunisia, Lithuania, and Egypt. The issues Bernie Sanders champions are legion. I started to make a list of the more prominent ones, the more significant ones, but they got too long. Besides, it's better to hear them from him. Suffice it to say that Vermonters re-elected him because of his unique voice. He stands up to speak for working-class people and low-income people and the elderly people and a vast body of citizens who don't vote because they don't feel part of the 2-party system. We feel privileged to have him spend the evening with us at the Northshire Bookstore. Bernie, thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that very generous introduction. And let me thank Northshire Books for having this reading here tonight. As I think all of you know, and one of the points that Huck and I make in our book, is that in industry after industry, there is growing concentration of ownership, and certainly one of the areas that is taking place is in bookselling. And fine independent bookstores like North Shore are being asked to compete against very large multinational chains, and we're very proud that in the state of Vermont we have such fine bookstores as North Shore. And we're also delighted that C-SPAN is here tonight, because similarly, in terms of the media, it is, and we'll talk about this later, increasingly difficult to get alternative points of view out through a media which is, again, owned and controlled by a few very, very large corporations. And C-SPAN, I think, is one of the bright lights in contemporary television, at least, in that alternative points of view can get out around the country. Let me tell you a little bit as to why Huck and I wrote the book Outsider in the House. He and I have been progressives for all of our adult life, and we detect that all over this country there is a feeling of pessimism and depression among progressives, not only because of the rise of the right wing in this country or Newt Gingrich, but also because of, in many respects, the collapse of the Democratic Party and the understanding that with all of the problems facing this country, we have a two-party system which is heavily dominated by big money interests, and that most of the very important issues facing ordinary people are not only not dealt with effectively, they are very rarely even discussed. So what Huck and I wanted to do in this book is to show the people of this country that it is possible to function politically outside of the two-party system, that you can take on the Democratic Party, you can take on the Republican Party, you can take on big money interests, and if you are persistent enough, or in my case maybe dumb enough, that you keep coming back year after year, you can actually have some success. And I think that that's a lesson that needs to get out all across this country. Because of the many problems that we write about in the book, probably the one that we feel most strongly about is the fragility of American democracy. The fact that in the last presidential election we had less than half of the people vote in what was in fact a very important election. That 2 years before that, when Gingrich and his friends took power, we had 38% of the American people voting, 62% did not think it was important enough to vote. That poor people in America virtually have no participation in the political process. Most working people do not. And that we felt that it is important to talk about that problem and to give some hope to people who in many respects have lost hope in the political process. And I think the message that we wanted to make is that if you have the guts and the persistence to stand up, to identify yourselves with working families and low-income people, if you take a message out to the American people that if good people come together, regardless of their background, if we're talking about people in the trade union movement or workers, people who are active in women's rights or environmental rights or veterans' rights or concerns about senior citizens or concerns about children, that if people are able to put aside their little differences and come together and ask the questions about why this great country is not providing a decent standard of living for all of its people, that if you can reach out to those people, you can be successful. So I would say that most importantly, what this book is about is in fact a measure of hope at a time when for many progressives all over this country, things are not looking good. And we want to say that if you talk about the right issues and we talk about our view of what we think those issues are, if you reach out to people, if you bring people together, and if you're persistent and you keep coming back and back and back, you can win. So that's probably the most important point that we wanted to make. And second of all, we wanted to talk to people, especially I think young people, about the importance of politics. A lot of young people have not a clue about the relevance of politics to their lives. And I have regarded as one of the important aspects of my job as Vermont's only congressman to go out to almost every one of our high schools over the last 5 or 6 years and talk to the kids. Because I think it is important that young people understand that politics, no matter what their point of view may be, is extremely important to their lives, and many of them do not understand that. And we used as perhaps a case history the work that we did when I was mayor of Burlington from 1981 to 1989. And we showed how progressives who are prepared to stand up and fight for the right things can make a profound change in a community, and in the process of doing that can revitalize democracy. In the city of Burlington, one of the accomplishments that I am most proud of is that over a 4-year period, and as you all know, we have elections in Vermont every 2 years, that over a 4-year period, from 1979 to 1983, we came close to doubling the voter turnout in the city of Burlington. That a lot of working people and young people who had otherwise given up on the political process came out to vote, and not only to vote, but to participate in the political process because they realized that politics could be relevant to their lives. As we started various types of councils which had power, as we extended political power to low-income and working people and to women and to people concerned about the environment, as we made concrete changes in the city, people said, you know what? I guess government does make a difference. Look what we can accomplish if we work together. So we very proudly talk about what we accomplished in Burlington, not just, because we're proud of that, and we are, but to show that if you're prepared to reach out to people and develop a grassroots democracy, you know what? People will come in and participate. The reason that half the American people don't vote, and probably in the next congressional election you'll have 65, 70% of the people not coming out to vote, is not, in my view, the fault of the people. It's the people look out on the political landscape, people watch the television, and they do not see or understand the relevance of politics to their lives. Some people do know the relevance of politics to their lives, and those are the people who contribute $50,000 or $100,000 to the political parties of their choice. They go to the $5,000 fundraising dinners the Republicans and Democrats give. They understand the relevance of politics. But then the word goes out to ordinary people, to the working stiffs of this country, hey, don't get involved. Everybody's a crook. You don't need to understand all about these things. Trade policy, it's too esoteric for you. Foreign policy, forget it. The environment, forget it. You don't need to know about those stuff. We'll give you O.J. Simpson on the television. You don't have to participate in this stuff. We'll give you, sex and sensationalism. But, hey, politics is too hard for you. Just leave it to the experts. Leave it to the lobbyists inside the Beltway. So we talk about Burlington as a case history of what happens when you open up city government and you bring people in and you help to transform what goes on there. And then we also do something in the book which I think is interesting, and that is a lot of progressives all over this country are intimidated by the political process. Well, gee, how do you go about doing it? How do you raise money? How do you reach out to the media? How do you do all of these things? So what we do in the book is perhaps give people a behind-the-scenes approach and understanding of what goes on in a real tough campaign. Now, as Ed mentioned, we ended up winning this campaign by a very generous vote. But when we began the campaign, let me tell you, that is not what we understood what would happen. It's always nice to know the ending. If you know the ending before you begin, life becomes a lot easier. But in this campaign, we were taking on not only Gingrich and the leadership of the Republican Party. I am proud to tell you, as Vermonters, that I was on the hit list, the top dozen, for Gingrich and the National Republican Committee. And as some of you may have remembered, we had every leading Republican, from the chairman of the National Republican Committee to Dick Armey, who is the majority leader. Every week they were bringing in somebody else. I was on their hit list, and they gave the legal maximum amount of money that they possibly could to my opponent. And in addition to that, we made another hit list. I made 2 hit lists, and that is corporate America's hit list. And I was also singled out as one of those folks they wanted to get rid of. So we were taking on both of those very, very powerful groups. And we wanted to show people around the country again that despite taking on the most powerful political organization probably in the world, and that's the National Republican Committee, and taking on big money interest, you can do it. And we give a little bit behind the scenes discussion of what it is like to run a progressive campaign. How do you do it? Folks here in Manchester received literature door-to-door distributed by our campaign. Well, how did we do that? You got some telephone calls. Maybe you didn't want to get them, but you got them from Sanders for Congress. Well, how do you organize a grassroots telephone campaign? How, when your supporters don't have the kinds of money that your opponent has? The book begins actually with my getting very nervous when Dick Armey came to the state of Vermont for a $500 a plate breakfast for my opponent. Well, needless to say, Bernie Sanders doesn't have $500 a plate functions. If I did, my supporters would laugh me out of the room. Very few of them have $500 to contribute to a campaign. So how do you deal with that? How do you raise money? We ended up raising $1 million. How do you do that? Well, you do it by getting over 20,000 people to contribute, on average $35 apiece. And we talk about the $5 bills that come in from senior citizens all over the country, and occasionally a rumpled $1 bill, and the notes to go with that. So if you can't raise money from corporate PACs, and I don't take any money from corporate PACs, and you don't get a lot of money from rich folks, how do you raise the money that you need to mount a serious campaign? And we talk about that. How do you reach out to the media? How do you do political advertising? Should a progressive, a democratic socialist do 30-second television ads? Or is that somehow immoral and we should just let the Republicans and the Democrats do it? Well, we do them, and we do them well. Occasionally we've done 5-minute ads. How do you do that? And we talk about that. So we wanted to tell people all over the country who are interested in electoral politics, give them some hands-on information about how they could mount a campaign. And then we also wanted to talk about the role that I've been playing in Congress. Now, many of you know, you hear about this issue and that issue, but I wanted to put it together. And I also wanted to put it in the context of the Gingrich agenda. As you know, when Gingrich and his friends were elected, they launched what many people consider to be the most extreme right-wing agenda in certainly the modern history of the United States of America. And as chairman of the 58-member Progressive Caucus, I helped, along with a number of other members of Congress, play a strong role in, I wouldn't say defeating that agenda, but at least slowing it down significantly so they were not able to go as far as they wanted to go. And I talked about other issues. When I was first elected to Congress way back in 1991, I dealt with issues like the Persian Gulf War, and I opposed that war. And I wanted to tell you how it felt to be a member of Congress, to put his card, and the way you vote in Congress, you got a little card, looks like a credit card, and you put it in the machine, you press yes or no. And on one of the votes on the Persian Gulf War, there were, I think, 6 other members of Congress who voted with me. And I said, my God, this is going to be a very short political career. I'm putting in there, looked up on the bulletin board, there's a board over there. Nobody's up there yet. All right, well, I think this war is wrong, and pressed my button, pressed the button, and I said, well, okay, 2 years, and that's it. But it turned out not to be the case. We talked about the role that we played. As some of you know, despite the fact that the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, last year we were able to raise the minimum wage. And that is an issue that I've been working on from my first day in Congress. Now, how do you do that? How do you raise the minimum wage when you have the leadership of the Republican Party, who controls both bodies, adamantly opposed to raising the minimum wage? Well, the way you do it is to create a grassroots movement so that the overwhelming majority of the American people end up saying, no, it is more immoral. It is absurd to ask people to live on $4.25 an hour. And we did that. We developed a grassroots movement to do that. And there's a lesson to be learned in that when you involve people in the political struggle for common sense ideas that the vast majority of the people believe, then even people like Gingrich are going to be forced to bend. And they did. And I also talked a little bit in the book. We have a chapter on what we call the scapegoating of Congress. And this is what that is about. You see, Mr. Gingrich and Mr. Armey have a real problem. And their problem is that they represent about 2-3% of the people in America, the richest people in America. And it is very hard for them to go forward to the American people and put ads on television saying, American people, I want you to vote for me so we can give huge tax breaks to the rich and then cut back on Medicare, Medicaid, and education. Please vote for us. Well, they probably wouldn't get a whole lot of votes if they did that. But that's really what their program is about. They represent the millionaires and the billionaires and multinational corporations. Now, that's their problem. Now, how do they solve their problem? They solve it in a very brilliant way, with a lot of polling and a lot of enormous sophistication. What they do is divide America up in a dozen different ways. They play black off against white, and white off against Hispanic. They play Native Americans against immigrants. They play men against women, straight against gays. And they sit down, they do intensive research on how you can divide the country up so that you have working class people and middle class people ending up voting against their own best interest because they've been told that the reason they are working 50 or 60 hours a week, as they are, is not because corporate America is taking their jobs to China and Mexico. It's because all those poor people are living high off the hog in welfare. So we're all supposed to hate the welfare people, okay? And we don't look at what's happening on the top. And we're supposed to lower taxes for the rich because presumably they're going to reinvest in America and create great jobs here, despite the history of the last 30 years, which says that is exactly not the case, okay? So what they do, and we talk about how they do it with homophobia. There was a piece of legislation very clearly designed for the election time to, rouse hatred against gay people and so forth and so on. And we talk a little bit about the scapegoating Congress. And then we end the book in what I think is an interesting way. Maybe I'll just read a little bit about that and talk about that. And that is, what we say is, okay, we've talked about a lot of things, but it is fair of us to tell the reader, where do we go from here? We talked about the past. This is 1997. I've been reelected for my fourth term. Where do we go from here, and what are the most important issues facing this country, and how might we address those issues? And let me just touch on what Huck and I concluded that are the most important issues, say a few words about that, and then we can open it up for discussion. First issue that we thought to be enormously important is that while the wealthiest people in America are becoming much richer, the fact of the matter is most people are becoming poorer, or at best hanging in economically. So I know you've been reading a lot on the front pages of the newspapers about the great economic boom, but as I go around the state of Vermont, people say, well, must have passed over Vermont. Not for me. I'm working 3 jobs. Somebody's getting a boom, but it ain't me. And what the reality is, and Huck and I go into it a little bit, and let me just touch on that issue. Well, let me tell you some of the other issues, then I'll go back to it. So that's the first issue, that despite what you read in the newspapers, what do they say about liars and statistics? You got a lot of statistics out there about economic growth and increased income, but they forget to tell you the real truth, and that is that almost all of the increased wealth is going to the richest 1%, the richest 5%. People in the middle class are working longer hours for lower wages and so forth. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then another issue that is of enormous consequence, which is virtually not talked about at all, is the crisis in American democracy today, the fragility of American democracy. I am not quite sure what you would describe the phenomenon, the political phenomenon that exists in America today. Now, we knew, for example, that 7 or 8 years ago, before Nelson Mandela took power, and the African National Congress took power in South Africa, you had a country there which had a democracy, but it was a democracy limited to the minority, the white people, and black people did not have the right to vote. That was pretty clear. The situation is different in America. With few limitations, basically anybody who really wants to can register to vote. Sometimes it's hard, but you can do it. And yet the reality is that in the next congressional election, in 1988, I'm guessing that maybe 35% of the people will vote, 65% of the people will not vote. So people now can vote, but they don't vote. Low-income people, probably to the tune of 80 or 90%, don't vote at all. Very large numbers of young people don't vote. You have elections which are dominated, as you all know, by big money. So you have a lot of people not voting. People most in need absolutely do not look to the political system as a solution to their problems, and elections are dominated by the people who have the money. Is that a democracy? Now, if Mr. Gingrich and his friends get their way, the perfect election is when you have a handful of people with a lot of money voting. That will be the essence of democracy, and the vast majority of people not voting. And we talk about things like Clinton signed the bill a couple of years ago that is a small step forward in the right direction. It's called Motor Voter, making it easier for working people and low-income people to register and vote. Incredibly enough, you had Republican governors in California, elsewhere around the country, fought this tooth and nail. The idea that poor people might participate in the political process, what is this world coming to? Don't they understand that politics is only for the rich and the powerful? And they try to really not implement the motor voter bill, and people have to go to court and so forth and so on. And Huck and I discussed, how can we go further? How do you open up the political process? Going back to the city of Burlington, we opened up the political process. We showed that if you open the door and you tell people that you can make a change, you can have an impact on your lives, people will walk in the door. But certainly that is not the agenda, certainly of the Republican Party and of many people in the Democratic Party as well. So we talk about that important issue. And then we talk about another issue that is never, ever talked about on CBS or NBC or ABC or Fox. And I'll tell you what it is. You promise not to tell anybody. The issue is corporate control over the media. See? Now, you may not even be familiar with that issue because nobody talks about that issue. That's all. You ain't going to see a program on CBS about corporate control of the media. You're not going to see it on NBC. And yet, it is perhaps, of all of the issues, we can argue which is more important. I would argue it ranks up there as one of the very, very most important issues. And it's not talked about by anybody. So let me give the people in this room a quiz here. Who owns NBC? Anyone know? General Electric. General Electric, one of the largest corporations in America. Who owns CBS? Westinghouse. Who owns ABC? Mickey Mouse and Disney. And who owns the Fox television network? Our friend Rupert Murdoch, the right-wing billionaire. Okay. So those are the people who control most of what Americans learn about, because as you know, as Ed will probably tell you here, books, people are reading less and less books, and people get more and more of their information from television. So you have four large, right-wing, multinational corporations who are telling the American people what they are supposed to know. And let me tell you, the results of what they do are absolutely astounding. For example, you find that there was a poll done a couple of years ago. Washington Post and Harvard did a poll, and they asked the American people, basic knowledge about the political process. And they said, can you tell us the names of your 2 United States senators? 75% of the American people could not name their 2 United States senators. Well, can you tell us the name of your member of Congress? 66% of the people could not name their member of Congress. They said, okay, who is the Vice President of the United States of America? That's a tough one. And he has a short last name. 40% could not name Al Gore as the Vice President of the United States. And then they asked people, well, where is your tax dollars going? Now, if you listen to Gingrich and his friends, the way we're spending all of our money is foreign aid and welfare, right? Well, that's about 1% each. Okay, so people didn't have a clue about how much we spend on defense spending, about tax breaks for the wealthy, about tax system. People don't know it, and one of the reasons they don't see this stuff. No one sees this stuff on television. Now, for example, I happen to believe and discuss in this book the importance of working people coming together in trade unions as a way to improve their lives on the job. People who are members of unions earn about 25% more than non-union workers. And when unions come together, they're able to have a political impact in Washington. Okay, so I'm a pro-trade union person. Has anybody in this room, and I should tell you there are about 15 million Americans, that's a lot of people, who belong to trade unions in America. Has anybody in this room ever seen on primetime television one program which talks about the positive role that trade unions play in America? It's not allowed to be on. It's basically not allowed to be on the air. You haven't seen it. 15 million trade unionists. The unions have played a very important role, not only in workers' rights and in decent wages, but in things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, affordable housing, many other programs. Not one word. Basically kept off the air. And we even talk about so-called public television. Okay? Public television has a lot of programs for people who invest in the stock market and all these other business-type areas. There's no program on public television about the needs of working people because, they don't put huge amounts of money into public television. So we talk about that. We talk a little bit about health care and the crisis in health care, and how if Bill Clinton had done the things in the last 3 years that corporate America has done in terms of health care, he would probably have been strung up, because we talked years and years ago about the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. Remember that? For some of you who may still have a doctor whose name you know. The sanctity was very important when people opposed, and I didn't support Clinton's bill, I believe in a single-payer healthcare system. But now no one worries about the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship as we're all forced into managed care and into HMOs, and we talked a little bit about education. But let me say a little bit about the economy, read you briefly from the book, and say this, because you're not going to see this on television too often as well. The richest 1% of Americans now own 42% of the nation's wealth. That's a lot, 42%, compared with 19% in 1976. The top 1% now owns more than the bottom 90%. Now, do you ever see that discussion taking place, the morality of that? Okay, that's a discussion we don't see too often on television, nor do we see it within the Democratic and Republican parties. Between 1983 and 1989, 62% of the increased wealth of this country went to the top 1%, and 99% of the increased wealth went to the top 20%. The CEOs of major corporations now earn 170 times what their workers make, the largest gap between CEO and worker of any major nation. Now, we wrote this book a few months ago, but we're already way out of date because the latest statistics last year, CEOs received a 54% increase in their compensation, right? While working people received about a 3 or 4%, and many workers saw a decline. So when we talked about the gap between CEO and worker being 170 to 1, hey, we were already way out of date. It's now over 200 to 1. In 1982, there were 12 billionaires in the United States. Today, there are 135 billionaires, and we have people like Mr. Gates, who is now worth somewhere between 20 and 30 billion dollars. Meanwhile, the past 20 years have seen declining or stagnant income for 80% of all American families. In fact, adjusted for inflation, the average pay of 4/5 of American workers plummeted 16% in 20 years. Now, we see that all over our state of Vermont. We see it all over America. What does it mean? It means that people are working longer hours. Now, you remember ancient history, way back when, 20, 30 years ago, when actually one breadwinner in a family could actually earn enough income to take care of the family. Remember that ancient history? Something about Greek civilization, when one person could bring in enough income. That does not exist in Vermont, and that exists in very few places in the country. Women now, whether they want to or not, many women do want to work, but many women would prefer to stay home with the kids. But that option is not open to them anymore because wages have not kept pace with inflation. The inflation-adjusted median income for young families with children, headed by persons younger than 30, plunged 32% between 1973 and 1990. 20 years ago, American workers were the best compensated in the world. We were number one. Today, American workers rank 13th among industrialized nations in terms of compensation and benefits. In other words, all over Europe, Europe has its own economic problems, high unemployment. But workers in Germany who are in manufacturing make 25% more than American workers. They have far more time off, much better benefits. In 1973, the average American worker earned $445 a week. 20 years later, that same worker was making $373 a week. And they are working harder for less money. U.S. workers put in about 200 more hours per year than West European workers, who typically obtain 4 to 5 week vacations, often legally mandated. Now, how many folks do we have who work in the state of Vermont who get 4 or 5 weeks paid vacations? Not too many. So with all of the new technology and all of the automation and all of the information highway and all of the computers, the end result is that for the average person, they're working longer hours, less time with the kids. And we talk a little bit about why that is so and how we might be able to change it. Now, let me talk a little bit about the other issue that gets, as I mentioned earlier, very little discussion. That is corporate control of the media. A knowledgeable and informed electorate is essential to a working democracy. We fall far short of that ideal. A principal source of the crisis in American democracy is the oligopoly. There it is. Oligopoly. A handful of mega corporations controlling the media, which ostensibly informs Americans about what is happening and what our political choices are. Americans get about 85% of their news from television. Almost all of that comes through 6 major television networks. NBC is owned by GE, CBS by Westinghouse, ABC by Disney, and Fox by Rupert Murdoch. CNN was recently bought by Time Warner, the world's largest entertainment conglomerate. Public television is also increasingly controlled by a wide variety of corporate interests. And the point that we make is that you cannot have a vital democracy unless people have information about what is happening in their country. So you just stop and think for a moment. Think about the enormous amount of time that the media decided to give us about O.J. Simpson. Everything you never wanted to know. I think they still do programs on O.J. Simpson, okay? Meanwhile, the collapse of the middle class, hey, they missed that story. Just couldn't quite get it. And I remember talking, and I get around and I talk to some of these guys who are heads of television networks, and it's very clear. It's clear for two things. Number one, when you have corporate control over the media, obviously they don't want to raise issues which conflict with their own well-being. If we know to be the case that General Electric in the early years of Ronald Reagan paid nothing in taxes, and they want to go back to the date when this large multi-billion-dollar corporation pays nothing in taxes, do you think they're going to talk about the fact that the tax burden on corporations has declined significantly over the last 20 years? They're not going to talk about that. And the burden has been shifted onto the middle class. They're not going to talk about that. And if we are concerned about the absurd trade policy of this country and the fact that companies like GE are taking our jobs to China where they're hiring people at 20 and 30 cents an hour, do you think they're going to be talking about that too much? I don't think so. And if they're not going to be also, when GE and companies like that are major manufacturers of military equipment, we were on the floor of the House just a few weeks ago. I was leading the effort to try to reduce military spending. Can't quite figure out why we have to spend $262 billion this year for the military, and that's only part of it. Then you got the intelligence budget, you got nuclear power, and you're talking about $300 billion a year on the military, and you go up to Gingrich and his friends and say, by the way, who is the enemy? Can't be China, because we just voted for most favored nation status with China. I didn't vote for it, but Gingrich did. Clinton wants that. Corporate America is investing tens of billions of dollars in China. It can't be China. It's not Russia. Corporate America is investing huge amounts of money in Russia. Is it really $300 billion a year against Cuba? Maybe that is a little bit of an overkill. Maybe. And then you add NATO's couple of $100 billion on top of that, it makes no sense at all. But, those are issues that we don't see. For example, there's almost no reporting of what's going on in terms of the military budget. And we're very proud. Ben & Jerry's in the state played a very good role trying to call attention, put national ads with other progressive businesses. Why don't we cut military spending when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, 22% of our kids? Why don't we cut military spending or the CIA budget, the intelligence budget? I helped lead the effort to try to do that when you have millions of American families who can't afford to send their kids to college. Why don't we do that? Well, we don't discuss that too much. So, make a long story short, what we try to do in the book is talk a little bit about some of the issues that I try to raise in Congress that many Republicans and Democrats don't want to raise, that the corporate media certainly does not want to allow to be discussed. And in all humility, I think it's a good book. It's a readable book because what we do is, it's not a complicated book and it's not this boring treatise on political theory. What we do is go back and forth between the campaign. We take you into the campaign, and then we switch it back to, maybe my early political days, and go back into the campaign, and finally ends up on election night. So I hope that you will enjoy the book. I think it has some good information, and I want to thank all of you for the support that many of you have given me over the years, and I'm delighted to answer any questions if people have them. And thank you very much. Okay, fire away. Yes, I think you're supposed to talk into the mic.
I'm what they call an atomic veteran. We worked for 25 years to get benefits for atomic veterans, so I know that a few people can do something. But I'd like to ask, why isn't there anything discussed about the fact that the Gulf War was a nuclear war? There's nothing said about depleted uranium and what's happening to these young people.
Well, as you may or may not know, I don't know if you know it, but I am playing an active role in that whole issue. Let me just say a word or two about that. And I'm playing, there's a fellow from Connecticut, Chris Shays, who's head of the committee that I'm on, and he's doing an excellent job in raising the issue. Now, let me back up and tell you what's been going on. After the Persian Gulf War, some of the veterans were coming home and they're saying, we're not feeling well. We're having aches, and we're having pains, and we're having gastrointestinal problems, and we're having sexual problems, we're having memory loss, our wives are getting sick, diarrhea, we're having a whole bunch of problems, which has been defined as Persian Gulf Syndrome. And the initial response from the Department of Defense and the VA was, there is no problem. Hey, everybody gets sick, what's the problem? And more vets were coming back to say, no. I went over there. I was healthy. I can barely walk now. I'm really debilitated. something is wrong. And finally, after a lot of vets began to stand up, raise this issue, the DOD and the VA, they said, yes, we acknowledge there is a problem, and we have concluded that the problem is stress-related. Okay? Now, the fact of the matter is, as all of you know, stress is in fact a serious issue. And we all know that people sitting in the midst of a war suffer from stress. It's not a joke. But clearly, more and more of the symptoms that were developing and more of the studies that independent physicians were doing were suggesting that this was far more than just a stress problem. So what did we learn? We learned that the DOD administered to well over 200,000 of our soldiers pyridostigmine bromide, which they used in an experimental basis. They got a waiver from the FDA and used for the first time in a way like this as a anti-nerve gas agent. And then we also found that the Persian Gulf theater, the military theater there, was a chemical cesspool, that a lot of these guys were using all kinds of pesticides and insecticides. We had burning oil wells. There was the use of depleted uranium, as the gentleman indicates. For the first time in a war, we used weapons that pierced, went right through Iraqi tanks. There was a young man in northern Vermont whose job was to take Iraqi bodies out of those destroyed tanks. And for the first time, people were exposed to that type of radiation. And then what happened is more and more people began to sign up for the registries which were developed. And we now have an estimated 60 or 70,000 people who have signed the registries with various symptoms. I've been working hard on this issue. We just released the other day right here in our own state, which only sent over about 325 members of the National Guard. And I'm not quite sure how many active duty members. We think maybe 100, 150. That we're finding some 150 of our own people have various symptoms, including, what really concerns me, is a number of these young men are having memory problems, which suggests to me that there may be some neurological problems. And I met with these guys last month, very serious problems. Some of the women are getting sick as well. So to answer your question, if we had left now you also know that at the end of World War II, the Department of Defense, when they exploded atomic bombs in the Southwest, despite the fact that there were physicians and scientists who then knew the potential danger of radiation, our troops were exposed to that. A lot of American troops surrounded those bomb blasts, and it took years and years before we finally got the DOD to recognize that problem. You are aware that in Vietnam, a lot of our soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange. It took the veterans organizations an enormous amount of work working with people in Congress to finally get the truth out about what Agent Orange was about. So we think we're into that fight again, and we are working very, very hard. I just submitted to members of Congress a couple of weeks ago a letter which said, please tell the Presidential Advisory Committee on Persian Gulf illness, who had concluded that stress is the cause of the problems, that they've got to look at the impact of chemicals. And without much trouble, I had 85 other members of Congress sign that letter, and we're working very hard on that issue. And in fact, in the next couple of weeks, I hope to get an appropriation to get money out of the DOD and the VA to an independent government agency to look at what we call the synergistic impact of chemicals. I happen to believe that what you're looking at is a form of multiple chemical sensitivity. These guys have been bought, they took drugs, they've been bought by chemicals, and I think that's at least one of the reasons why they're ill. So we're working really hard on that issue. The DOD and the VA, it's like pulling teeth. It is not easy. Other questions or thoughts? Gentleman right here.
In today's New York Times was a full-page ad by the Concord Coalition, and they're making the point, they've been making this for a long time, that since Americans live longer than they used to, longevity has been increasing, that therefore they should be working longer and not be Medicare eligible at 65 or Social Security eligible at 65. Now, I'm a C-SPAN junkie, and I depend on your vote to know which way it's going. But I have never heard a congressional hearing deal with this topic, nor have I seen floor debates on this.
Right.
And it's important for my sons and the sons and daughters of many others here.
Thank you very much for that very important question. We held a press conference on that in Burlington last week and came out very, very strongly against raising the age to 67. In addition to that, they want to charge $5 for home visits and make it harder for people to get the oxygen that they need at home. Let me talk about that. You have heard on CBS and NBC and ABC a lot about the deficit. You haven't heard too much about our trade crisis, the decline of the standard of living of American workers, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the fact that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty. But you have heard about the deficit situation. Is the deficit situation an important issue? It is, in my view. Should we move the country toward a balanced budget? We should. Let's talk about a couple of things. First point that I want to make is how many of you know that in the last 4 years, Congress has made significant progress in moving this country toward a balanced budget. In 1993, as I recall, the budget deficit was close to $300 billion a year. That's a lot of money. It is now down to about $45 billion. And one of the reasons that we have had some success is that after Clinton took office, and one of the good things, in this book I'm very critical of Clinton, but one of the good things that he did do after he took office in his first budget was to raise taxes on the rich and the large corporations, and in fact lower taxes on the working poor. I think he now sees that almost as a mistake. He offended his wealthy friends, but nonetheless, it won by, I think, one vote in the House, and I was the only non-Democrat that voted for it. And it won in the Senate, I think, also by one vote or something. But the deficit is an important problem, and we have made progress. Now, when we talk about deficit reduction, there are various ways that you can balance a budget. Let me give you some ways. You can cut the hell out of Medicare. Gingrich wanted to cut Medicare by $270 billion over a 6-year period several years ago, and we stopped that. But this time, Mr. Clinton and the Republicans have come together and decided to cut Medicare by $115 billion over a 5-year period, not in a way that hurts financially the individual, but in cutting back substantial amounts of money to providers. In our own state of Vermont, our small state, hospitals would lose $75 million, elderly people over a 5-year period, which means that the cost is going to be passed on to the private insurance companies or to you for out-of-pocket costs. Can you imagine this? Somebody with an acute illness, a senior citizen at home, would now have to pay $5 for every home health visit, which if you needed somebody to come to your house 3 times a week, could run you, $600-700 a year. They put a cap on it, but I think it's about $700. Now, if you're trying to get by on $8,000 or $9,000 a year, to be paying an addition, $700 is outrageous. And of course, the premiums were scheduled to go up. So you can cut back on Medicare. You can cut back on Medicaid. You can, as Gingrich wanted to do, not Clinton, to his credit, cut back on higher education. You can cut back on environmental protection. You can throw children off of welfare. 70% of the people on welfare are children. And if you do all of those things, you know what? You can move toward a balanced budget. You can do it. I happen to think that that's an immoral and outrageous way to move toward a balanced budget. So let me give you an alternative way that you can move toward a budget, which Mr. Gingrich certainly does not agree with, and President Clinton does not agree with. Okay? Let's talk about welfare. And let's understand that a lot more welfare is given to large multinational corporations than is given to poor people. Both right-wing and left-wing and centrist groups agree that we spend about $125 billion, that's with a B, a year on corporate welfare. We have wonderful programs that encourage and help corporate America invest in third world countries so that we can throw American workers out on the street. We have programs which encourage large multinational corporations in the defense industry to merge and in the process lay off American workers, give us less competition so the taxpayers will end up paying more money. And on, we give huge tax breaks, to business people who can take out their friends to fancy restaurants for a couple of $100 for a meal, and we allow them deductions for that, accelerated depreciation, and on it goes. Okay. So if you're serious about deficit reduction and you have the guts to stand up to big money, then you take a hard look at corporate welfare. Second of all, the defense budget and the intelligence budget. We're just going through that right now. As I indicated earlier, both Democrats and Republicans agree, and the president, that roughly speaking, we should have a military budget of about $262 billion a year. The Republicans won on the floor of the House more money for B-2 bombers that the Pentagon didn't even want. Do you know what one B-2 bomber costs? Cost $1.5 billion for one plane. Okay, putting that into perspective, does anyone know what the budget of the entire state of Vermont is for 600,000 people? It's about $1.5 billion. One bloody plane equals the budget of our entire state. Now, you've heard a lot of discussion recently about the National Endowment for the Arts. All right, Gingrich and his friends want to kill it. We just can't afford in this country to get arts into the schools, provide lower-income people access to the arts, help artists, create. Can't afford to do it. $100 million for the entire National Endowment for the Arts, less than 10% of one bloody B-2 bomber that the Pentagon doesn't want, and they increase funding for the B-2 bombers. We spend about $100 billion a year defending Europe and Asia. Against whom? Well, as soon as I get that answer, I will come right back here to Manchester, Vermont, and I'll tell you, $100 billion a year. Okay? From 1970 to 1990, 7 major pieces of tax legislation was passed by the United States Congress under Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, and mostly Democratic Congresses. The results of those 7 pieces of tax legislation is that for 90% of the people in America, that is the middle class, the working class, lower income people, taxes went up. For the upper 10% and the largest corporations, taxes went down. Now, given the fact that corporations today are contributing significantly smaller percentages of money to our treasury, given the fact that we've seen a proliferation of millionaires and billionaires, I know it's a terribly radical idea. I know it. But that's why you sent me to Congress, right? To say that maybe millionaires and billionaires might be asked to pay more in taxes so we can bring in more revenue and lower taxes for the middle class and working people. Now, what happened during that period, during the 70s and the 80s? Why did, who knows why? I'd be curious if you know. What was the major area that the middle class saw an increase in their taxes? Who knows? You know, you pay it every day. What is it? Social Security and Medicare, the FICA taxes. They went way up. So that right now, you're paying about 7.5% of your paycheck in FICA taxes, Social Security and Medicare, before you pay your first nickel in income taxes. You see? And it's a totally regressive tax because there is a maximum. They've decided, our friend Alan Greenspan, who worked with Reagan on this issue, decided, what's the maximum, 67,000? Yeah, something like that. They've decided that somebody who makes $67,000 a year will pay the same in FICA taxes as somebody who makes $1 million a year. Meanwhile, they lower income taxes for the rich and large corporations, raise the FICA tax. So in our state, which has a very high percentage of self-employed people, you know what they're paying in FICA? 7.5 plus 7.5 before they pay their first nickel in income tax. Totally regressive tax. But that's, so there are 3 or 4 ways that you can move to balance the budget in a way that is fair. You go after corporate welfare, you go after the intelligence budget, you go after the military budget, and you create a tax system that has some strength and more progressivity than what we have. If you do that, not only can you balance the budget, but you will have substantial monies left over to start dealing with our national debt and to adequately fund education so that families all over this country will be able to send their kids to college. Maybe we can make a dent in the 22% of our kids who live in poverty, deal with the environment in a stronger way. Now, the question the book addresses, well, why doesn't that happen? I would say most people in America believe that that's the case, should happen. It doesn't happen because we have a system where the majority of people don't vote, don't know what's going on, and members of Congress are surrounded by these corporate lobbyists who know exactly what committee and what member to go to. And that's why the rich get richer and almost everybody else gets poorer. Should we balance the budget? Yeah. But we can do it in a fair and progressive way and not hurt the elderly, the poor, or working families. Gentleman right here.
You mentioned this vote on the Foundation for the Arts as a very distressing vote. And from the inside, where I'm sure you see it, What is the composition of this right that we're dealing with? Who are these people? I mean, this was a very troubling vote.
Yes.
And a mixed vote. Thank you.
I think what happened, Gingrich's revolution, and we have to, as somebody who opposes virtually everything that Gingrich stands for, we have to give him credit for being a brilliant political organizer and a brilliant ideologue. Essentially, you have in Congress right now, just to generalize in a simple sense, you have older Republicans who are conservatives. They're conservatives. They want to see everything being equal. They want to protect their wealthy friends. They want to see the government play a less active role, and so forth and so on. But what Gingrich did is encourage a much harsher and more right-wing group of people. And he led them, and he raises enormous sums of money from his wealthy friends, and then they have a very tight network by which they literally have almost like a farm team by which they get very bright young people in the legislatures. They get them to run for Congress. They adequately fund them, and they give them the right buzzwords. Now, the National Endowment for the Arts is, when I talked about scapegoating and playing off one group of Americans, whether blacks are played off against whites or immigrants against native-born or women against men, what the National Endowment for the Arts, this is the way it goes. Here's the speech. Here's the 30-second speech. Do you want your tax dollars to go to fund ugly pornography, which does this, that, and the other thing? Is that where you want your tax dollars to go? And then what they will do is they'll check out that sometimes they lie, sometimes it's true, that you had some program, some amount of money going to some artist who did something ugly with it. Neglecting to mention that, and maybe that is, a fraction of 1% of all of the art grants went out. So this is what you'll hear about over and over again. What they will not talk about is that here in the state of Vermont and in schools throughout this country, kids are being exposed to wonderful cultural programs that they would not be exposed to if it wasn't for the NEA. Our own Vermont Council on the Arts has traditionally done a great job, as have similar groups throughout the country. So what they do is part of their thing is you can take out, welfare is the same thing. In any area of life, there's always going to be abuse, right? In any area of life. So what you do is you take out one area of abuse, you play it over and over again, and that's your 30-second soundbite. Do you want your taxpayer dollars to go to this ugly example of pornography? And you got the right wing they worked very hard on that issue. I don't think, to tell you the truth, again, what the American people probably don't understand, that the entire National Endowment for the Arts, which allows millions of people to enjoy theater, music, art, is less than 10% of one B-2 bomber. So what most people also do not understand, that compared to European countries, we spend a fraction of public money on the arts compared to what Europe does. And it becomes, in a very, to my mind, and when I was mayor of Burlington, we worked very hard, and we started our own Mayor's Council on the Arts, which, if some of you get up to Burlington, we have a dozen things going on. And what the importance of that is that art and culture is part of what human life is about. And I believe, and I think many members of Congress believe, that it's wrong, is that whole area of human existence be open only to people who can pay $50 to buy a seat to go to a concert. And you need public funding for the arts to make arts affordable or to make it free. And I think I would, to be very honest with you, raise substantially the amount of money that we put into the arts. But to say the least, it is an outrage that they want to cut it. Gentleman in the back. Yes, please. Yeah, sir.
I wanted to also add to the question that the gentleman just asked, but more in environmental terms, about the people who are up against in Congress. Now, already we've seen an awful lot of damage done to the environment, and a lot of twos and twos not adding up to four. For instance, in terms of flood damage, there's an incredible amount of flood damage happening whenever there's too much water, because the watersheds have been degraded and there's no more soil to take up the water. Now, what is it that these people in Congress actually see in terms of future generations? Where is their urgency, and do they simply expect the world to be paved over, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, one of the things that I first, one of the first strong feelings that I had when I went to Congress in 1991, I come home to Vermont almost every weekend, and I try to get around the state, and I try to talk to as many people as I can. When you go out and you talk to ordinary people in Vermont, they're hurting. Many of the people don't have health care. They're paying too much for health care. Elderly people can't afford their prescription drugs. People working longer hours. So there's a sense of urgency that I take with me back to Washington. But you go back to Washington, and you got a number of people who live in a different world. They live in a country club world where, you know, you have $50 dinners or $100, you know, activities and so forth and so on. They sit at fundraising dinners for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party where people come up and raise. There was one just in Massachusetts, I think, yesterday. It was in the Boston Globe. All it cost you to go to a very nice fundraising dinner at somebody's house was $20,000 a couple. Not bad. Most people I know do not spend $20,000 for dinner in an evening. And whenever I say that, people laugh and they can't believe it. $20,000. I mean, Gingrich and both the president have held fundraising with $50,000 a couple. Now, what world is that in? What relationship does that have to do to the overwhelming majority of working families in the state of Vermont? It is another world entirely. So when you get caught up in that world, then you hear the problems of the people who spend $50,000 for dinner. Now, I suppose they have problems, but they're not the problems the most of my constituents have, and I live in a somewhat different world. So what ends up happening, and this is the culture and the climate, and let me also say here, I don't mean to say it's very easy to be anti-Congress. I want to tell you something, that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of very good members of Congress, many of whose names you don't know. And I think many of them are in the Progressive Caucus, and they work 60, 70, 80 hours a week for their constituents. And they're doing exactly the right thing, you know, doing the best that they can. But you've got a hell of a lot of people there who associate with millionaires and billionaires, who receive a lot of corporate PACs, and they look at the world from that point of view. So then what they say is, gee whiz, if we, you know, if the issue becomes controlling corporate profits as opposed to protecting the environment, there's not much of a choice if you've received hundreds of thousands of dollars from corporate polluters. And that's basically what goes on. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the workfare component of the new welfare system put forth by the president?
I think clearly that if somebody can work, they should be asked to work. But I think what we should understand, that when we're talking about so-called welfare reform, is that 70% of the people who are affected are children, that you have many low-income women who wanted to raise their kids as best they could with limited resources, that the so-called welfare reform bill, and I say so-called because I don't think it's real welfare reform, but that legislation often will force women out of their homes without providing adequate child care for the kids. I don't know what happens to a woman with 2 young kids who's now forced to work where there is not adequate or affordable child care. Second of all, there are a lot of people who don't have the skills that are necessary. Now, there's a big debate, I don't know how much you've read about it, but that our Republican friends now think that people, you know, we got to get these people to work. Work is wonderful. Work is what it's about. Well, now what they want to do is take people who are in workfare and, you know what, not allow them to earn the minimum wage. Deny them the minimum wage. Now, that is not only unfair to those people, do you know what else it does? It lowers the entire wage structure for everybody. So that if you have a cafeteria worker in a local school who's making $6 an hour here in Manchester, and the town can hire somebody for $4 an hour below the minimum wage, that $6 an hour person may lose her job, or else wages will be bidded down even lower, which is a strong strategy of what the Republican Party now stands for. Last year, when we fought to raise the minimum wage and was successful, we had to beat back an amendment, very powerful amendment, that got a lot of Republican Party support, that would have eliminated the concept of the minimum wage for small businesses. So you would have people in Vermont and all over this country forced to work for $3 or $4 an hour. Now, not only is that unfair and wrong for those people, once again, it lowers the wage structure and forces wages down, which is ultimately what NAFTA is about and what most favored nation status with China is about. Essentially, right now, American workers are being forced to compete against people in Mexico who earn 70 cents an hour, people in China who are earning 20 or 30 cents an hour. Do you follow what's going on with Nike? You see what Nike does? Nike goes to any place in the world where they pay the lowest possible wages. They're now in Vietnam. They've discovered Vietnam. That's now the lowest wage area in the world. So you're hiring women there for 20 cents an hour, and then they bring the product back to the United States. They sell it to our kids for $100, $150, and the guy who owns Nike, Philip Knight, ends up with $5 billion in personal profit. And we're trying to work on that issue, as a matter of fact. We're saying to Mr. Knight, that if the people in this country are good enough to buy Nike sneakers, maybe we might be good enough to manufacture some of them as well. So, other questions, or gentlemen right here?
What would you say to somebody who would support the changes in welfare laws, not because they're supporting the rich, but because they think the old system wasn't working?
Sure, and the old system was, the question is, in case the mic didn't pick it up, what about people who think we should change the welfare system, not because they want to protect the wealthy, because they think it wasn't working? I would say, you're right, it wasn't working. It wasn't working. So we want to make it work. And how do we make it work? Well, number one, if we are asking people to work, I think that that's totally appropriate, okay? But then we want to make sure, A, that there's a job available, don't we? Right? We can't say to you, we demand that you work, but gee, there is no job available that your skills will allow you to take. That's unfair. And the second thing we've got to say is that we think that no parent in America should be forced to do the wrong thing by his or her kids. Now, if you were a single dad, say, and you had 2 kids, we say, we want you to work. Okay. You have a right to say, yeah, but I want to see my kids get adequate child care. I think we have that right. So I think that is at the heart of what was wrong with so-called welfare reform. So I believe in welfare reform, real welfare reform, but what was passed in the last Congress was not real welfare reform. Throwing hundreds of thousands of disabled children off of their benefits is not real welfare reform. Telling an immigrant who came to this country legally, not illegally, who came to this country legally, who was working, who was paying taxes, that he and his family are not eligible for American benefits when they always had been, they're paying taxes, that's not right either. So I do believe in real welfare reform. The system has not worked well, no question about it. We wanted to change the system. Unfortunately, I don't think the changes that were brought about were proper changes. Illegal immigrants, serious problem. It is a very serious problem. And I think we've got to deal with that. If somebody does something illegally, it's illegal, and we've got to stop it. We've got to figure out how to stop it. But one of the interesting points that I would make about illegal immigration is that it is no secret. I mean, this is not much of an issue here in the state of Vermont. It is an issue in California and in states that border Mexico, is that, as you know, many employers loved illegal immigrants, didn't they? Because they could hire people who did not have their papers for below minimum wage. You can exploit the hell out of those people, because where are they going to go? They're going to go to the police? I don't think so. So, you know, some of the major perpetrators of the problem of illegal immigration were employers who really wanted to get slave labor almost. Other thoughts, questions? Woman in the back. If you want to come up to the mic, please.
And just a side note, a person who asked about childcare, I do childcare and I've done childcare advocacy for years, and there is not anything like the number of childcare slots that we need for workfare. But I kind of want to go out of my field. You mentioned Agent Orange, which made me think of our good friends at Monsanto. Is Congress...
Our good friends at Monsanto, yes.
The government, I know it's an issue in Vermont because of BSG. Yes. Congress, the government, the FDA, anyone going to touch genetically engineered crops before they're out there?
Well, let me, I think probably not, but let me back up. I introduced, I think, the only resolution that was introduced about BST, which all of you know is a synthetic product made by Monsanto, which is a multi-billion-dollar chemical and agribusiness corporation. And it seemed to me that for 2 reasons we were concerned about it in the state of Vermont. Number one, family farmers all over America, including the state of Vermont, are suffering from low milk prices, and we're losing our family farmers. We fought very hard for the Northeast Dairy Compact, which will help somewhat. But the last thing in the world that we need is more milk being produced to drive prices down even lower. And the second concern, which was a health concern, is given the fact that we have already an abundance of natural milk, I don't know why we wanted to get milk from cows that studies had indicated were made sicker by being stressed out. What you were doing is forcing the cow to produce significantly more milk. Now, is that something we want human mothers to do? We want to give them a product to force them to produce more milk? I don't think so. And I don't think we want our kids necessarily drinking that milk from a cow. So we fought very hard, but when you take on companies like Monsanto, I had the guy who was head of the FDA in my office. Now, Congress does not deal with Monsantos. Monsantos decide what they want to do, and Congress follows what Monsanto wants. They're just too big and powerful for Congress to deal with. So that's the real. I mean, like many other multinational corporations. I mean, what you should understand, and you don't understand it, the American people don't understand it, they always get what they want. Now, sometimes it may take them an extra couple of months to get it. They may be slowed down, but they don't stop when they're defeated. They come back, and they come back, and they come back, and they have an army of lobbyists and public relations people mean, they fought for this NAFTA thing. Every corporation in America told us how great NAFTA was. Well, 4 years later, NAFTA has been a disaster. Lowered wages, we lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. There's still not one major newspaper in America editorially who will even tell us that. They're still pro-NAFTA. So it is a tough issue taking on corporate America. That is the struggle of our times. This book attempts to talk a little bit about it. And I guess is my time rapidly elapsing here. So it's, yeah. All right, let me just say, as you know, I am so proud to represent our great state, and I appreciate the willingness of the people of Vermont to put up with somebody who is not a Democrat, not a Republican, who sometimes has ideas a little bit outside of the mainstream, and I thank you all very much for your support over the years. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Bernie Sanders will be sitting here at the table. You can have further discussion with him, and he'll be happy to sign a book for you. Good.